Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we are featuring a soon-to-be-published book entitled Who Will Rescue Us? The Story of Jewish Children Who Fled to France and America During the Holocaust by Laura Hobson Faure. Joining us this afternoon as commentators are Rebecca Belding and Susan Silliman. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University. I co-chair the Washington History Seminar with Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And as some of you may know, the seminar was launched in 2010. It's been a collaborative and nonpartisan initiative of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association. Before March 2020, we gathered in person at the Wilson Center here in DC, and since the summer of that year, we've been gathering here online, assembling participants across the globe and even larger audiences than we did when we were in person. A couple of quick things before we get going. First, as always, we like to recognize a key figure whose behind-the-scenes labors make these seminars possible, and that's Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center. Second, please take note that our next session of the Washington History Seminar will take place 1 week from today, on Monday, March 31st at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We will reconvene to discuss Cornell Chang's A Fractured Liberation, Korea Under U.S. Occupation. As always, we hope you can join us. Third, on the logistics front, today's session will be recorded and can soon be found on the seminar's YouTube page, where many dozens of past programs are archived. Fourth, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function. In that case, I get to call on you, you get to unmute, you get to pose the question in your own voice, or you can write your question using the Q&A function in Zoom, in which case I get to read your question, and we'll call on as many folks as we can. And lastly, today's session is being co-sponsored by the Albert H. Small Normandy Institute, of which I happen to be a co-director. The Institute is based on the campus of the George Washington University, and it focuses on the history of the Allied invasion of occupied Normandy in June of 1944, a decisive turning point in the Second World War. And each year, the Institute works with some 15 teams of high school teachers and students in an intensive online program on D-Day and the Normandy campaign, as well as the larger context of the Second World War. All right, that's the preliminaries. Now on to business. It's my pleasure to introduce our featured author this afternoon, Laura Hobson Faure, a professor at the Panthéon-Sorbonne University, Paris I, where she holds the chair of modern Jewish history and is a member of the Center for Social History. Her research focuses on the intersections between French and American Jewish life during the 20th century. She is the author of A Jewish Marshall Plan, The American Jewish Presence in Post-Holocaust France, published in 2022, a book that won the National Jewish Book Award. She is also co-editor of Enfants en guerre, sans famille, dans les conflits du deuxième siècle, published in 2023. Today, she will be speaking on her most recent book, Who Will Rescue Us? The Story of the Jewish Children Who Fled to France and America, which will be published by Yale University Press in a few weeks' time on April 22nd. Laura, welcome to the seminar.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eric, for this wonderful introduction. I'd like to start by thanking the Wilson Center and the American Historical Association for this invitation, which is a true honor. I'd also like to thank Eric and Peter for putting this together. Now, I have a PowerPoint to share. So let me just set this up. And I will put it into slideshow mode. Okay, very good. We're set up? Okay, very good. So I'm here today to present my book, Who Will Rescue Us? It explores a period of severe political crisis and the family separations that this crisis provoked. The topic, unfortunately, remains relevant today, but I will approach this in historical perspective. More specifically, the book focuses on the efforts to evacuate Jewish children and children whom the Nazis called non-Aryan children from Nazi territories. Beginning in 1933, but especially after 1938, parents and organizations began sending children on transports, and the term in German was Kindertransport, with the hope of removing them from the increasing anti-Jewish violence. Today, the word Kindertransport is associated with images of children, identity tags around their necks, arriving in the United Kingdom, and I'm quoting a fabulous documentary called Into the Arms of Strangers. The British program to evacuate children from the Third Reich has earned its dominant place in the historiography. The United Kingdom extended its hospitality to some 10,000 children. If the British example is exceptional due to both the number of children saved and the widespread mobilization it entailed, other countries also received Jewish children fleeing Nazi Germany. 4,000 children were sent to mandatory Palestine. European Jewish communities in the Netherlands, Denmark, Italy, Switzerland, and Belgium also organized Kindertransport programs. France, too, we're going to hear, became a temporary refuge to a very small group of unaccompanied children. Fewer than 500 children were granted visas for France. Who Will Rescue Us represents the first full-length academic study of the Kindertransport to France. The significance of the French Kindertransport is not in the number of children it tried to help, but in the historical problem it represents. It provides us with the opportunity to question and explore what happens when refuge becomes a trap. I am referring, of course, to the Nazi invasion of France that occurred in May 1940 and the subsequent occupation of France. France decided to collaborate with the Nazis, and this decision meant that the Jewish refugee children who were granted legal refuge by France's Third Republic became pariahs under Vichy's French state. This means they needed to be rescued yet again. Fortunately, a group of advocates in the United States decided to take action. My book explores the evacuation of mostly Jewish children from Central Europe to France in 1938 and 39, and then the second evacuation of some of these children from France to the United States in 1941 and 42. Who rose to the challenge of rescuing these children? Who saw the danger? How did the children themselves experience displacement? After explaining the genesis of this project, I'd like to focus on two of the book's main arguments before entering into conversation with Rebecca and Susan, whose research has nourished this project. I couldn't have chosen two better discussants, and I thank you both for taking this time to engage with the book. Now, my doctoral research focused on the reconstruction of French Jewish life after the Holocaust. You see here on the left. And it led me to the archives of an organization that was extremely important during World War II for Jewish children, and that was the Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, and known as the OZE. I'm going to refer to it as OZE here. It was there that I first learned in the archives of the OZE that several hundred Jewish children were evacuated from Vichy France to the United States in 1941 and 42. I set out to understand the organizational infrastructure that allowed for these migrations, and especially the experiences of the children themselves and the networks they created while migrating. As I began interviewing the former children and reading their writings from the period and their later memoirs, I soon realized that none of them were French, and that most of them had arrived in France on the eve of World War II. Many had lived together before coming to France in Jewish orphanages in Germany and Austria. In other words, I stumbled on a very important topic in Holocaust history that had remained unnoticed in the case of France. I am referring, of course, to the fact that France had received Kindertransport children. I thus reoriented my initial study with the goal of understanding not one, but two evacuation schemes. The first from Central Europe to France, and the second from France to the United States in the middle of World War II. While my larger research seeks to understand the lives of these children during the Holocaust and its long aftermath, so from the 1938 to 2000 period, My goal in this book was to focus on a very short period between 1938 and 1942. As Holocaust scholars know, this was a moment of transition when Nazi policies against Jews transformed from persecution to extermination, if we're going to use Saul Friedlander's terms. Who Will Rescue Us represents a transnational social history of these two evacuations, taking into account the multiple actors on each side of the Atlantic and their rapidly shifting perceptions of danger. But also, it delves deeply into the children's lives in order to understand, to the extent possible, how they felt and coped with their forced migrations. Children are at the center of this study. Their sources, produced during the events or later as adults, show the diversity and the complexity of their experiences. Now, without over revealing the book, which I hope you'll read once it's unstuck. It's kind of stuck in transit right now to the United States, but here it is. I have an example of it here. It came out in the UK already. I would like to explore two of its main themes. The first theme in the book I'd like to explore today is that of Holocaust rescue. In France, about 75,000 Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, either through deportation to Nazi camps or on French soil. Nonetheless, for many complex reasons that we can explore together in the discussion, a large percentage of the Jewish population survived World War II in France. When we grapple with the Holocaust in France today, we confront the philosophical dilemma: is the glass half empty or is it half full? Do we focus on deportation and murder, or do we focus on the real but rare acts of assistance that Jews received? This is not only a French question. There are many studies today that focus on Holocaust rescue and center on righteous individuals. The term hero is omnipresent. As important as it is to study Holocaust rescue, I argue in the book that there's a strong risk of skewing the historical record when we collect a series of fortunate events into a common narrative on rescue. Furthermore, in our current political moment, some prefer to emphasize the positive aspects of the Holocaust instead of focusing on the much harder questions of state and civilian complicity in deportation and genocide. Instead of framing rescue as a story of heroic individuals, I argue here for a problem-based historical approach to rescue. To be saved, Jewish children had to be evacuated from Nazi territories. Who perceived the danger? Who rose to the challenge? And how did rescue networks work from a material and human point of view? By analyzing the rescue process as it unfolded, the book tells a complex story that defies easy generalizations and tales of heroism. In the case of the Kindertransport to France and America, it was Jewish women who saw the danger first, especially after the state-sponsored violence that took place in Nazi territories on November 9th and 10th, 1938, in a night known as Kristallnacht to many, but which historians prefer to call November Pogrom. Women sought to make alliances, both vertical with members of the state and horizontal with fellow citizens, to bring Jewish children to safety. André Salomon, for example, worked from her native Alsace and orchestrated the arrival of 52 children in the first weeks of December 1938. The Baroness Germaine de Rothschild, working from Paris, networked within French government circles and managed to secure another 240 visas for children. In the United States, women such as Cecilia Rozovsky, Justine Wise-Polier, and after the 1938 November pogrom, many non-Jewish women and men, including Marion Kenworthy, Quaker minister Clarence Pickett, fought to change and gathered together to change immigration policy in the United States to bring 20,000 children to the US. They failed to change the policies and failed to convince Congress, but they did establish a non-sectarian organization called the U.S. Committee for the Care of European Children. And you see it here. It's the second organization on the slide. Now, the U.S. Committee was created in July 1940. By this time, however, the danger was not only for Jewish children in Europe, but for all children who were under the threat of Nazi bombs. The US committee's focus had shifted from getting Jewish children out of Nazi territories to evacuating all children from Great Britain. My book provides a detailed analysis of the attempt of Jewish individuals and organizations to convince the US committee to evacuate Jewish children from France. Contrary to what we often emphasize in stories of Holocaust rescue, this was not a straightforward or easy process. It took 6 long months to convince the US committee to say yes to evacuating, quote, refugee children from France, and note the language. But there were many children in need in wartime France, not just Jewish children. While today we know that Jewish children were in acute danger, this was not at all evident at the time to all. The US committee mandated the American Friends Service Committee, the Quaker humanitarian organization, to organize the evacuations from France. However, and this is where things become a little bit complicated, the head of the American Friends Service Committee in France was quite enamored with Marshal Pétain, Vichy's head of state. I do not have time to elaborate right now, but let us simply state that the evacuation program was not fully supported by the director of the American Friends in France, who preferred that non-Jewish children also benefit from it. And the American Friends managed to include 40 Spanish non-Jewish refugee children in the summer of 1942. But nonetheless, over 300 children were evacuated to the United States. The great majority of them were, in fact, Jewish, and this saved their lives. Most of them became the sole survivors of their entire families. Now, as organizations were working through these complex dynamics, the Jewish refugee children themselves were trying to process the tremendous upheaval of their lives. This leads me to a second argument that I make in the book, and the second theme I'll discuss tonight. I argue that we need to consider those being rescued, in this case children, as an active part of the story and not just as passive victims. The children produced a great deal of historical documentation as they migrated. Their sources reveal that their actions were numerous and that they were surprisingly implicated in their own rescue. Most studies on children during and after the Holocaust treat children as separate individual cases. And perhaps due to the fact that I have training in sociology, I sought to renew the historiography by studying them in their groups. After the war, the children who survived the Holocaust were often assumed to have been completely alone. Some certainly were, and many felt abandoned. Yet sometimes these children still had one parent or surviving siblings and extended families. They may have been part of tightly knit friendship groups. While children's relational worlds rarely survived intact, new networks emerged during the war, at times creating surrogate families. In the book, I study children's lives in the collective homes where they were cared for in France and ask how they negotiated displacement, acculturated to a new society, dealt with separation from their nuclear families, and created new support networks. Now, one of the ways that children coped with displacement was by documenting it, often in connection with other children. While in France, the children lived, as I mentioned, for the most part in homes run by Jewish organizations, where they were encouraged to write, and their writing took many forms. Many kept diaries, others had autograph books, and often they corresponded with their parents. They also produced collective newspapers and documented their lives through photography and drawing. They quickly assessed what adults wanted to hear. They perceived real dangers and fought to be selected for the evacuations to the United States. Their yearning to remain in contact with their parents can be seen through their disciplined decisions to write their journal entries in German after French had become second nature and had taken over their maternal languages. Some children participated in complex letter writing schemes via Switzerland in order to remain in contact with their family. Ties to siblings, parents, and other children and caretakers are richly documented in these child-produced sources. Like Alexandra Zarpruder, I consider these sources to be fragments, and I quote her, quote, extant records stranded in a sea of missing material, evoking but surely not representing the vast, uncountable, incalculable loss, end of quote. These sources cannot be considered to be representative, but they do provide us with a rare view into children's inner worlds. I wish I could show images in my PowerPoint, but I can't. But instead, I'm going to talk through a couple of examples. Children really sought to help one another as they coped, and they did so through their writings. One example is Elfrida's autograph book. Elfrida had an autograph book, and around Yom Kippur, 1939, the children exchanged and signed each other's autograph books and gave one another advice. One piece of advice that Elfrida received was in erroneous French, because her friend was learning French at the time, a fellow refugee child, and she said to her, be proud to be Jewish. Another example of a child processing departure is Hilda Mann's drawing of her uncle's guest house in Pirmasens, Germany. And this drawing is a gorgeous yellow house. The top 3 floors are completely intact, but the drawing says this is what happened on November 8th and 9th, November 9th and 10th, 1938. And you see the bottom level of the house is completely destroyed. The windows are broken, and there are stick figures in front of the house depicting violence. This was probably a school assignment that she was given, because I have other examples of children talking about November 1938. Finally, Heinz Love's diary, a child from Vienna. He's about 13 years old, and his diary was illustrated by his friend, Paul Peter Porsche. Paul Peter Porsche became a very famous artist. He was a fellow child in the homes. Both boys survived the war, which is why I can consult their diary, right? And this diary really made me think and rethink what diaries are as a source, because we consider them to be a very intimate individual document, but in fact, the children are creating these documents together. Now, for historian Alexandra Gabarini, analyzing diaries and other contemporaneous sources produced during the period provides a nearsighted vision of the Holocaust, and it is part of a theoretical commitment to understanding Jews' agency during the Holocaust. As they grew into adulthood and later in life, the children in this book wrote letters and memoirs that grapple with the past and provide insightful testimony. These retrospective sources, which include also video testimony, of course, are qualified by Garbarini as far-sighted. They tell us a great deal about the meaning individuals impart on their past. Distance from the event does not make them less authentic, but it does provide an additional narrative of distance reflection that requires analysis in and of itself. And this is also true for oral history. I conducted about 50 oral history interviews for this book, which also helped me understand how the former children, now in the winter of their lives, reflect upon their past. What makes oral history different, to quote Alessandro Portelli, is how the interviewees ascribe meaning to their past and connect disparate events into a narrative. Such interviews revealed what the children were afraid to discuss at the time. A beautiful example was provided to me by one of the children named Ernst Welfer, who was in his 90s when I began interviewing him. He explained that his mother managed to get him a place on the March 1939 transport from Frankfurt because his parents were donors to Frankfurt's Orthodox orphanage. The family rarely attended synagogue except for the high holidays. Even then, it did not belong to one particular synagogue and alternated where it went each year. The family was not indifferent to its Jewish identity. Before leaving, young Ernst had his bar mitzvah, but it was not Orthodox. Still, Ernst received a strange parting gift from his mother. He told me, she gave me a prayer shawl to wear daily, as Orthodox children wore under their clothing. And she said, the Orthodox have taken you out, you stay with them, and you do what they do. So for all my time in Paris, I was Orthodox. My mother said, look, you stay with the Orthodox group, you'll be safe. So I did. I learned a lot. Now, there's a great deal to unpack in this quote, but today I want to just mention that its significance comes to light when we compare it to another interview in which the interviewer explained to me that she too lied about coming from an Orthodox family for fear of being sent back to Germany. As a result, these teens were cared for in a children's home for Orthodox children in France, where they quickly learned the prayers and passed as Orthodox. But contrary to what adults assumed, the Orthodox children's home was full of children who were not Orthodox, and children who were at times, not all, but at times playing a role. So far from passive wards, the children expressed in their sources the many ways they sought to maximize their own safety and control over their lives. But if I know their stories, it's because they survived to tell them. In this book, I also grapple with the challenge of writing the absent into history. Not all of the Kindertransport children who came to France survived the Holocaust. Of the 292 children I was able to document with certainty in the database, at least 37 were deported to Nazi camps. This raises a fundamental question that needs greater recognition in Holocaust scholarship. The dead cannot tell their stories. I have tried to the extent possible to acknowledge this problem by leaving a space for their absent narratives, like a missing photo in an album. With these observations in mind, I hope to have given you an overview of some of the themes in the book. Let us now dig deeper in conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura, very much. Terrific. Our first discussant this afternoon is Rebecca Erbelding, an historian who works at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington, D.C., where she's the museum's historian on the American responses to the Holocaust. She served as a lead historian on the museum's special exhibition, Americans in the Holocaust. If you've watched the 2022 PBS documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust, directed by Ken Burns, Lynn Novak, and Sarah Botstein, you will have seen her as an on-screen commentator and historical advisor. Her book, Rescue Board, The Untold Story of America's Efforts to Save the Jews of Europe, published by Doubleday in 2018, won the National Jewish Book Award for Excellence in Writing based on archival research. It was featured in a session of the Washington History Seminar at the Wilson Center that year. And I should note her work on a photograph album created by the commandant of the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp was the basis of a theatrical production, Here There Are Blueberries, whose performance at the Shakespeare Theater Company here in Washington I was fortunate enough to see about 2 years ago. Rebecca, welcome back to the seminar.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Wilson Center. Most of all, thank you, Laura, for writing this book. As I told you before we went live, I have been waiting for this book for a long time. And so I have many notes and many questions. So I'm going to assume that you and Susan and I can be in dialogue about them when we are done. So the first thing I want to talk about is the title of the book. I love that the subtitle of the book is The Story of the Jewish Children Who Fled to France and America During the Holocaust. Not the organizations that brought them, not the story of France and America. You are fronting the children, which you do throughout the book, which I think makes it different from a lot of the work that has focused on kind of organizational and individual efforts to rescue people before this. But I also love the use of the word rescue in here. I know that I have grappled with this, you grapple with this in the book. How do we talk about rescue? You mentioned this idea of the hero narrative, but the answer that you seem to provide in the book to what is rescue is that everyone is rescuing and also no one is rescuing, that you can rescue yourselves, that the wider reception of rescue should be the big and small acts, down to, as you said, Ernest Valfer's recognition that his mother's admonishment that he should try to stay with the Orthodox was a second way that she is rescuing him. And that often rescue is sometimes found only in retrospect. So I would love more on your reflections about the concept of rescue, and especially how and if you think that kind of Holocaust readers, or that we can all nudge rescue and the idea of rescue into this larger bucket of including someone who looks the other way one day and doesn't turn someone in or doesn't recognize someone who's using a false identity. All of those things amounting to a form of rescue. This book also incorporates an incredible amount of detective work, which sometimes editors ask you to hide in footnotes or in a methodological essay. And I'm really grateful that there are pieces of the book where you and your editor agreed to allow you to make that known. There's a full page about the development of this Jewish Protestant circle of connection in which I mean, I don't know how you did it, honestly, dive into what clubs people belong to and the social circles that they are belonging to, and how, you know, these forces that led people to work together to rescue children were often social and long extant before the kind of immediate crisis began. So I'm grateful to you and your editor for letting us into the book or into those detective stories. There are also a number of just concepts and topics that I loved that you included and would welcome any other discussion that you want to have about them. One is the idea of the enchanted parentheses, this moment when the children have arrived in France, the war hasn't begun yet, and for a second, it looks like they're going to be okay. I think that is, it's definitely a term I'm going to steal. It's a term that I really love, of this idea of maybe it will just be one act that will be necessary for survival. So often we talk about the phony war, and for the children, it wasn't that, because by the time of the phony war, this period after Germany invaded Poland, but before Germany invaded France, the children are already being cut off from their parents just due to the fact that Germany and France are now at war with each other. I was also very happy for the inclusion of Spain in the text. I think the role of Spanish Republicans and the number of Spanish refugees who arrive in France is often overlooked in the Holocaust story. We consider them two separate things. And I wonder what other opportunities you see for research to that end. And also, what did the organizations working in France learn to do or to avoid based on their experience with these Spanish Republicans who arrive in France in 1938, 1939. And I also, as you said at the beginning, I loved thinking about accounting for survival bias. You talk about looking at a near and far-sighted vision of events, near-sighted being the kind of contemporaneous sources that you're using, and then far-sighted as the oral histories, recognizing that you have to figure out how to account for the fact that you're talking to the survivors of an event. In terms of the tone of the book, I felt like this book is in such strong dialogue with Rebecca Clifford's book, Survivors, and with Maggie Paxson's book, The Plateau. They are all, I don't know if it's a coincidence that they're all about children and rescue in France, but they are all just deeply empathetic histories that take children seriously as sources, that takes their emotions seriously, their trauma seriously, and not just from what I think is the easy move, which is to look at the perspective of the adults surrounding them and the reports written about them, but to actually take their sources and their perspective seriously. It's a deliberate choice, and it's a really hard thing to do as a historian. And then asking your reader to hold that trauma and to hold their stories with you. I'm grateful for it. And I'm also wondering what these books together say about the future of Holocaust scholarship. If we're using these three books, yours, Rebecca's, and Maggie's, as exemplar texts, is this a trend in child-centered history? Is this a place where Holocaust studies can go more largely? I was just grateful for the deeply challenging empathy of these sources, which also, raises challenges, right? You were very clear in the book about the ethical importance of including your subjects in the work, the people that you're interviewing, showing them the sections that relate to their own history. I know that many of us are 20th century historians. We write about people who are sometimes still alive. And I'm wondering what advice you have for people who are writing about living subjects, particularly those of us who like to stay in the archives because it feels safer there and deeply vulnerable and challenging as a historian to show your work to your sources before it comes out. I'm also interested in learning more about the parameters of the project. I noticed that a bulk of the interviews were done in the mid 2010s. And so, what has changed between the time that you interviewed and the time that you began to write? What changed about the questions that you would have asked back then? And also about your decision to end the book basically in 1942 and then skip ahead to the present. So this is before some of the children that you write about escape into Switzerland, before the children who do make it to the United States really settle into life in the United States. And so I'm wondering how you set those boundaries for yourself. Are there things you would have liked to include if you had decided to go further? And do you see opportunities for future scholarship in those kind of margins? And I think lastly, many of the survivors that you worked with, and I think many of the sources that those of us may work with, were deeply involved, as you said, in networks with other survivors. And that was part of the methodology of the project. You would maintain touch with people, and then they would say, you should go talk to this other person, or you should come to this reunion or this party and meet more of us. But you are also writing about what those survivors remember about their histories. And I wonder how you account for this kind of group story that might emerge from people who are used to telling stories in tandem or may have incorporated pieces of someone else's story into their own. And I'm wondering how you accounted for that as someone who was really taking those sources very, very seriously. So thank you again for writing this, and I apologize for my many, many questions.
Not at all. We like many questions.
I love your questions. Thank you. These are the most amazing questions because I can tell you really dug into the book, and it's an honor to be read by you. So there's a lot to say. Shall I discuss now, or should we? Okay, so first of all, uh, yes, there was deliberate decision to put children at the center of the book. I was raising two children as I did the research and wrote the book, and still am, right? And so the idea of child-centered, this word kept coming back throughout my life, right? Child-centered, and I wanted the book to be child-centered. I wanted to situate the book from the perspective of the children. And yet, at the same time, there was a need to document from a social history point of view these organizational dynamics. And in a way, I think it was a transition between my doctoral research, which was much more grounded in organizational dynamics, uh, and really focusing on how these organizations intersected and dealt with one another, and then going into this this challenge that I gave myself, which is what would happen if we left aside the organizations and tried to enter into people's lives. And the challenge is, of course, finding the archives for that. And I wasn't anticipating the amazing finds that I found in the archives, diaries, correspondence. And I realized that it is very possible to write a history without these organizations. But in this case, we needed to document this tremendous network of organizations that did save lives. And it's very significant. The children that were saved, they become the sole survivors of entire families, as I said. So we're talking about just just one person living gives a heritage to German Jewish life, Austrian Jewish life, and entire families are kept alive through one child. So we see this importance of children. I'm very grateful to my editor as well, for Julian Luce. I'm not sure if he's here tonight, but for helping me come up with the title. This was a very hard book. It was very hard to find a title for this book because there's a lot going on in this book. There's a lot. There are several strands. One is, of course, um, that of children, the other is organizations, and I would say the third is this question of how can we write Holocaust history, this question of Holocaust representation, and how do we deal with these sources that come from such different periods of time, from the war years and from the post-war. And since we're on that topic, I do want to say that what I found most helpful was Alexandra Gabarini's work on theorizing this question of near-sighted sources and far-sighted sources. And the idea that she says very clearly both are equally authentic. And we have a tendency to think that the wartime sources are more authentic than the post-war. And I really like the idea of considering them equally authentic, but we need to analyze them differently because they are telling us very different things. Now, going back to the question of rescue, one of the things that I find perhaps disconcerting is that there has been a turn, and some scholars, just Natalia Alexiun, among others, have just published a book called The Rescue Turn, where they're actually pinpointing this, and we came to this conclusion exactly at the same moment, that there's been a great deal of talk about Holocaust rescue, perhaps at the cost of discussing deportation and murder. And when we commemorate the Holocaust in France, I really pay attention to what's being said and how much time in the commemoration is spent talking about the righteous among the nations and how much time are we spending talking about the Jews who were murdered. And I'm concerned that it becomes much easier to have a conversation about those courageous individuals who did very real and very important acts, but who were exceptional. And those exceptional individuals, when we talk about them and make them the focus, exclusive focus on the Holocaust, it's a way of resurrecting the myth of a resistance-based France. If everyone was rescuing Jews and everyone was in the resistance, then there was no collaboration. And so I find it to be quite dangerous, and a tendency that we need to counter with this problem-based historical research. Mark Roseman was also doing this before I was, of saying we need to look at rescue as a historical problem and looking at it from the beginning towards the end and not from outcomes towards in going back. Now, the other thing I say in the book, and I think it's very important, is that rescue doesn't always work. So people who are actually deported may have had someone turn the other way at a certain time. But when faced with the crushing nature of state-sponsored violence, rescue can only get us so far. And I also took pains, I hope this comes through in the writing, to make sure that we do not overestimate the agency of Jewish children or Jewish adults. They are victims of the Holocaust, and they do not have unlimited power to change the outcomes of the Holocaust. And so when we talk about agency, how do we do this without overestimating power and distorting individuals power. They don't have a great deal of power, but what they do have are tactics of an ability to think and make choices. And a simple example from the book is when a child is deported, he leans out of the bus window. The police have come to round him up, and he leans out of the bus window and he extends his hand and drops his bike key so that his friend can take his bike. And for me, this does not change the outcome. The child is deported. Um, but nonetheless, he's able to do something in that moment of powerlessness. And that's tiny action, I think, is extremely important to this story. Moving on, detective work. Yes, I love detective work. I think that I didn't become a detective. Instead, I became a historian. Okay. So I love the group, the Protestant Jewish group. I've been really it's been like the toughest case to crack in the book as to how is it that we have a Protestant count and his Russian mistress taking in a group of 40 Jewish children, whereas all the other caretakers are Jewish organizations. And there's no debate about how these children should be cared for in the Jewish press, perhaps intentionally because they might want to keep this out of the press, the arrival of the children for fear of greater xenophobia. The term enchanted parenthesis is a term that is not my own. It is a very common French expression, and Susan might know this well. It is the period of time between. It is. I'm taking it completely out of context, but the way I've heard it used in France is the time between the invention of the birth control pill and the moment when AIDS became an issue. And so this moment of time of sexual liberation was an enchanted parenthesis. Now, obviously, I'm not applying the idea of any form of sexual liberation for these children. The children were doing many things, but what that moment felt like between their arrival in France and the moment where already September 1939, as you said, the phony war began, and that took away their most beloved caretakers in some cases because they were mobilized for war or they were interned as enemy aliens. And so we see that initially some children portrayed it as like going to summer camp. But then things became more and more grave as time goes on, and the children were displaced yet again. In terms of the Spanish Republicans, it's really important, I think, that we think about what's happening for Jews in France in parallel and in relationship to the tremendous refugee crisis that far outnumbers the number of Jews and German Jews total since 1933 in France. Between 400,000 and 500,000 Spanish refugees, mostly Republicans, flee over the border in January of 1939 to France. And this creates a moment where the government says, I told you so. Look, here we received these children. France received between 15,000 and 20,000 Spanish refugee children, unaccompanied, during the Spanish Civil War. And so when the refugees fled over the border, the government said, I told you so. Look, it's their parents. And it was exactly at that moment when Jewish organizations were asking for visas. So it is absolutely not the fault of the Spanish refugees that the Jewish organizations did not receive more visas. However, that context was really informing the decisions made on the ground. The idea that many in France felt that there was a crisis, an absolute refugee crisis. I think there's a great deal more research that should be done on the relationship between the Spanish Republicans and the Holocaust. I think it's a huge area of research that is just begging to be done, especially to understand these are populations that are in the internment camps together. Over time, the Jewish population comes to outnumber greatly the Spanish population, but the Spanish Republican population is a population that sees what's going on with the Jews. And just from the stories that I've been able to hear and collect, I think that there is a tremendous topic waiting to be done to understand how they perceived the Holocaust. And also what they did, because these are Spanish Republicans. So these are people who are politically engaged. and responding to what they see around them. And then most importantly, if one goes to the internment camp Gurs in the southwest of France, they will see in the cemetery a section for those who had fought in the Spanish Civil War and who were interned in Gurs. And then the larger part of the cemetery, which is a Jewish cemetery. And some of the people who were in the Spanish Civil War cemetery were also Jewish. So we see this interesting interconnected history to explore. In terms of, I'm honored that you say that it's deeply empathetic. I struggled with I didn't struggle. I let myself be myself in terms of the question of distance, historical distance. And whereas some prefer to do history, you know, maybe with a cold distance that I just can't, I couldn't face my sources in that way. And because I'm someone who loves oral history and chooses to spend a great deal amount of time with the people that I do oral history with, I engage with my own emotions and with their emotions, and I'm not afraid of those emotions. And I think perhaps that's who I am. It's the book I created. I can't say more than that. I do really acknowledge the debt I owe to Rebecca Clifford and her research on children. I engage less with Maggie's work, but in terms of thinking about children, thinking about how children are actors and not just passive victims, moving beyond the idea that children are only victims. Children, yes, children are victims. They remain victims in this history, but they're also pushing back in really creative ways. And so trying to find those creative ways is really, for me, interesting. Um, the issue of restitution, there are very strong ethical imperatives, um, and the ethical imperative did not extend to showing the book to everyone that I interviewed. I want to be very clear on that. But when I could, and when I had a doubt, when I had a feeling that I'm not sure if they want me to say this, I tried to go back to the person. I tried, but I didn't manage to do that with everyone. And had I done that, I could have really risked um, causing the book to be edited or even not published. So it's very tricky. I'm of course waiting with bated breath to see how the families respond to the book, and I of course have their full consent for this research, and it was very clear. But I'm very, of course, concerned with the idea of not doing more harm to families who have suffered deeply and greatly. Um, I'm inspired by Hank Greenspan's work on listening to Holocaust survivors. And I began to interview people in 2010. I began to write this book, and I wrote it actually in 1 year's time in 2018. It was in the context of my habilitation, which is the degree needed in France to become a full professor. And then I set the book aside, and I think that's a great technique for writing, to set a book aside, let it marinate, and then I came back to it with more archives. In the meantime, COVID hit, and also though COVID ended, and I was able to dig into new archives and deepen some of my arguments. And so the other question is how did I deal with this question of group narratives and survivor narratives? On one hand, the group narratives were really interesting for me because it showed the importance of groups. And I think that we tend to segment children into case studies when we write about them. And of course, I'm doing case studies, but I'm constantly trying to keep them in a group context. And what I did with the networks issue was to try to, when we do a snowball interview, to start with several snowballs. And so instead of just one leading to another, I knew that politically some of the children were in very different, former children, of course, were very different from one another with very different political backgrounds. And so I was able to get into several nodes and then roll snowballs from there, I guess, if that makes sense. Um, I think that Susan has something definitely to add to this conversation. I've talked a great deal, and I'd love to hear what Susan has to say.
And you'll
Well,
now
let's see.
get that chance. But before I introduce our second discussant, let me remind folks that you can get in the queue now if you have questions. Again, you can use the raise hand function, in which case you will unmute. I will call on you. You get to pose the question yourself, or you can use a written version in the Q&A function in Zoom. You can start queuing up now, should you so desire. Okay. Our second discussant this afternoon is Susan Rubin Suleiman. She was born into a Jewish family in Budapest in 1939, just a few weeks before the outbreak of World War II in Europe. She and her family survived the Holocaust in Hungary in hiding with false papers, and they left the country after the communist takeover in 1949, arriving in the US a year and a half later. She is currently Professor Emerita of French and Comparative Literature at Harvard University, whose faculty she joined in 1981. She has many books, and among them are Crises of Memory and the Second World War, published in 2006, The Nemirovsky Question, The Life, Death, and Legacy of a Jewish Writer in 20th Century France, published in 2016. She's the author of two book memoirs, Budapest Diary, In Search of the Mother Book, 1996, and Daughter of History, Traces of an Immigrant Girlhood, published recently in 2023. This book was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award the following year. She has published over 100 articles in professional journals, as well as articles and reviews in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Moment Magazine, and other publications. She's won many honors, including fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the Central European University. In 1990, she received the Radcliffe Medal for Distinguished Achievement, and in 1992, she was decorated by the French government as an officer of the Order of Academic Palms. In 2018, she was awarded France's highest honor, the Legion d'Honneur. Susan, I'm delighted that you can join us this afternoon. Your turn.
Thanks so much. I'm very happy to be here and to join this discussion. I guess I'm wearing two hats here. The first one is as a scholar of the Holocaust, who's written quite a lot about child survivors, among others. And then also as a child survivor myself, although I have to say that I didn't take on that identity until very recently, because like many other children, who had the great good luck to survive the war with their parents, I never thought of myself for a long time as a survivor. And you know, after all, we had made it. I have aunts, uncles, grandmothers who survived. But you know, things change, and the very idea of a child survivor only entered sort of our consciousness about 35 years ago or so, in the late 80s and early 1990s, which is also when the so-called memory turn and historical studies really took off. So the idea of the child survivor as somebody who now is no longer a survivor but can remember their childhood kind of coincided. And in my own work, I have to say, I didn't start out as a specialist on the Holocaust or on memory of World War II, but it was around 1990 that I first began in the early 90s to write about the Holocaust and about childhood memory and about memory of the war. And, you know, I wrote books on that and also did a lot of teaching on that. And I should say, I guess, to some extent, going back to the question that Rebecca asked about is, you know, paying attention to children that Rebecca Clifford so well does and that Laura so well does. I would say, just to make a little case for literary scholars, because I come at this from literature rather than history, I would say that literary scholars took maybe actually started before the historians. Because we were very much aware of the importance of writing and of the fact that a great many, I mean, a surprising number of child survivors, especially in France, but elsewhere, became great writers. I mean, really great writers. For example, I'm thinking of Georges Perec, P-E-R-E-C, Perec, who became one of France's most important writers. And he was also a child survivor who wrote an incredible sort of memoir called W, or The Memory of Childhood, in the 1970s. And he's just one of many child survivors in France who have written terrific books. And so people in literature, I think, became more involved in the study of individual children's histories. I mean, Saul Friedlander, just as an example, who's a great historian, right? Laura mentions him, but he wrote one of the very early memoirs in French about his life as a child as an orphan, actually, as he became. His parents were deported in France during the war. So, When Memory Comes is the English translation. We in literature, I like to say, came first. However, I am very happy to have read Laura's book because your book really puts all these wonderful individual, sometimes great works of literary writing into a much broader context, and that is great. And I've learned a lot from it. And you explain, in the book, that as a historian, you're interested in studying groups rather than individuals. But I think one of your terrific accomplishments here is that you succeed in showing that groups are made up of individuals whose actions are the result of personal choices based on their awareness or their perception of what's going on in the wider world. So one example among many, you show that the children in group homes in Germany and Austria, from where they were taken to France, got to those homes in the first place because their parents were thinking that, oh my God, it's not safe anymore. I'd better get them into some kind of possible institutional setting where they will be taken away, where they will be taken out of the country. And this was a terrible a choice to make, to separate from your kid, but it was based on the perception of the danger that they had, individually. And of course, that perception became much stronger after, as you pointed out, after Kristallnacht, after 1938, after November 1938. So they were very eager to get their kids on the transports. Another example, which I think is great, is when the German army invaded France in May 1940, it was the people, the individuals in charge of children's homes in the Ose, who were, members of that organization you mentioned, and others who realized, oh my God, we'd better get these kids down to the unoccupied zone because now. Because that will make it much safer for them. And it was also these individuals who realized that the safest place for these kids was the United States, that they had to be gotten out of the country. And they are the ones that entered into negotiations then with the people who were, again, individuals from the Joint Distribution Committee, that other one you mentioned, the U.S. Com, the American Friends Services Committee, and so on. So I think the way you show that the collective is one thing, but it's made up of people. And I think that goes with what Rebecca was pointing about your detective work, that your ability to sort of hunt down who were these people, like where did they come from? What was their background? Who were their friends? And so that leads to my second point that, again, as a literary scholar, I'm very attentive to the way that books are written and the way that stories are told. And I really like the way that you structure your book, which is you have short chapters, each one ending with a kind of a question to say, to get this, we need to know more about that. And then the next chapter answers that question. And this was no easy task because you don't tell a linear story from A to Z. So what you do is you piece together a complicated puzzle, or I like to think of it almost like a mosaic, where each piece adds a crucial bit of information, until we have something like a complete picture. Although not always complete, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But sometimes you focus on the organizations that help the children, always keeping your eyes on the people, very often women, who created these organizations and ran them. And other times you focus on the children themselves, many of whom kept diaries, as you pointed out, and of whom you interviewed. You place a great deal of emphasis on the idea of agency. And we've talked about that a lot, but I think that one can't emphasize it too often, because it is a very important thing. And you mentioned that wonderful story of the boy whose mother told him, to say that he was Orthodox, although he wasn't. And she had no way of knowing, of course, exactly what would happen, whether it was really better for him. But you also point out that in that Orthodox home, he meets George Papanek. No, sorry, Ernst Papanek,
Ernst
who
Papanek, yes.
is Ernst Papanek, who runs the home and who becomes a very important figure in this boy's life as a kind of substitute father. So I was struck. Papanek is a hero of your book, I think, because after being in the home, he goes to the United States to escape from France, since he was himself in danger. He was a Viennese socialist, and then begins to campaign from the United States. Another hero of the book, I think, is Andre Solomon, who stays in France, but who's a woman, the Alsatian woman, and who is credited with saving hundreds and hundreds of children. So there are wonderful stories here that are interwoven and that we keep getting back to, that you refer back to from one chapter to the next, which I was especially haunted, really, by the story of the Gossels, Peter and Werner, whose mother stays behind. So the parents, even when they're separated, they manage to somehow, back in Berlin, Mrs. Gossels got in touch with a friend of a friend of a friend in the United States and helped her children get to the United States that way, although she herself was unfortunately deported and murdered in Auschwitz. I just think that these stories, although many people did not survive, including these parents, but at least most of the kids that you deal with did somehow survive, from what I gathered, either in the States or by having crossed over into Switzerland or something, which after all is great. And then, I would say that, well, two other things that I really liked before. I will ask one or two questions only. But two other things I really liked is that you are very even-handed, and you try to analyze even things that we would want to condemn right away. For example, you mentioned the head of the American French Services Committee, who in France, who came here to help, but maybe because he was aware that there was so much anti-Semitism back home, and he had to be careful not to just include Jewish children. So, on the other hand, maybe he was himself a little bit, tiny bit tainted by that. But you kind of, and he was a friend of Pétain, an admirer of Pétain. Uh, but you try not to be too condemnatory, to condemn him too harshly. You sort of give us, but I think you allow us to draw our own conclusions. And I think that's a very difficult line to tread, as a historian, to kind of let all the facts be there and give him some credit, not just say, oh, well, this guy was clearly one of the American anti-Semites or whatever. And so finally, I think that, and Rebecca hinted at this a little, but I want to really emphasize it. I think what I really like also is that in telling this complex story, you more than once point out that there are gaps that you'll never be able to fill in. And some archives have been destroyed. They'll never yield up their secrets. And too many people did not survive to tell their stories. It's an impressive gesture of humility on your part to admit that no matter how hard you've tried to track these documents and witnesses, you can only tell part of the story and maybe just a small part of it. That's the kind of thing, actually, that writers, literary people like me, are very aware of that. The kind of thing that great writers know how to do: call attention to all the ways in which they and their readers don't know things and will never know them. Perec does that all the time in W. And the memory of childhood. But it's not that often that historians emphasize the incompleteness of their work. So congratulations on that. Now I will just ask you just two or three questions. Of course, you can comment on anything that I've said, but I guess one question does go back a little bit to the process. I'm wondering which are the archives that you found most helpful, and which are the ones that you wished you had been able to consult, but that don't exist anymore. Uh, um, and then and anything else you want to talk about the process of the work. For example, how much emphasis to place on the retrospective accounts as opposed to the accounts from the period, and so on. The other question is this: that I was personally quite fascinated to learn just how much of a role private philanthropists played in supporting the group homes in France. In other words, both those run by the Osé, which were funded by the Baroness de Gainsbourg and the family, or others like the Chateau de la Guette, which was entirely done by the Baroness Germaine de Rothschild. So these two women were cousins, they were in the Rothschild family, were really quite, they emerged also as kinds of heroines at the time. And both of them went to the United States. And there again, like Papanek, they began to sort of campaign in favor of getting the children over from France. So I guess my question is, were you aware of the importance of these private philanthropists before you started, or was this a discovery? And so this leads to the third question, which is my last, which is, what surprised you most as you came to understand the complexities of the story that you were telling? Were there any discoveries that really astonished you and that you were not prepared for? So those are my questions.
Thank you. Laura?
Thank you, Susan. I can't tell you what an honor it is to have you read my work. And I mean I have Budapest Diary right behind me on my shelf. So I mean, like, to tell you, I mean, and not only I also have the books that you cited in the beginning, when we think about the importance of child survivors and their writings. Saul Friedlander's When Memory Comes, Nechama Tech, a Polish sociologist, right? But Dry Tears, Sarah
Well,
Kaufman.
Elie Wiesel, who was a teenager. I mean,
Yes, of course. And he's
Night,
in these
the
same homes.
most famous one of all, it was written by a child survivor, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that becomes the most famous. But I mean, for me, Sarah Kaufman's work, Rue Ordinaire, Rue
Absolutely.
Là-bas, is
Yeah.
absolutely, I think that you are absolutely correct in that literary scholars saw the beauty of these texts and went towards them, towards understanding them. And historians are starting to pick up on the trend, I think. I think you're correct. Ruth Kluger, still alive. I mean,
That's right.
they absolutely informed the way I approach the project. And I love reading first person testimony. It's one of the things I love. That is my absolute. I love entering into these life worlds, and that's also why I love doing oral history interviews, because it's really where I enter into someone's, in a way, their steps, and I try to understand the world through their eyes. And that is also why I love reading fiction, right? It's through that love of reading and entering into others' lives and recognizing the subjective experiences of this, which I think is the challenge, that I try to do. But I also followed a great woman's advice. I'm not sure if you remember the coffee we had back in 2000. I would say 17, or it was probably 16 or 17. We had
Oh,
coffee. And I told you about this project, and I was like overwhelmed with the amount of things I was finding and the different strands and the themes. And you said, just il faut patauger. dans les sources. You told me just wade around in your sources. Just wade around in them and like in a puddle almost. Just, kind of play in the puddle that make your sources and see what you come up with. And it was fabulous advice. It was so playful
Oh,
and I think that this book, I mean, I write in the acknowledgments that it's bittersweet for me to end the book because it was I paradoxically, such a joyful experience of writing this book, even though it is on such a serious topic. So in terms of this child survivor identity that emerges, and of course, the 1.5 generation article is so important to that. And that's really the post-war story that I set out to write. I started working on the post-war experiences of the children once in the United States. And so obviously they arrive during World War II, but one could argue, as with Nicholas Stargard, that the post-war period begins when the child is no longer in danger. And so even though it's the middle of World War II, they are out of danger. And technically, their post-war period can begin. And so it's this post-war experience. I was looking initially at their American experiences. And then I started to understand who these children were. And it was really an intuitive based project. And I think because it was a second book, I was more liberated than the way in which one approaches a dissertation. And so this idea of, well, actually I can, play around with this and I can take the rope backwards and see what happens if I follow them back to France. And then I thought, okay, well, actually they're not French, so I'm going to follow them back to Germany and Austria. And all of that was extremely surprising. I would say that that was the initial surprise, is realizing that that there was a Kindertransport to France.
oh,
That was
right.
probably
That's
the
interesting.
first surprise. It's such a huge topic in Holocaust history, and yet we consider it almost exclusively through the prism of the United Kingdom. And now, hopefully, that's going to change. More and more scholarship is emerging on the topic of Kindertransport to other countries. But at the same time, looking at it in a different place changes the way we approach the history. And I try to avoid some of the tropes of Kindertransport history to create just a very just to read my own sources and to see what I could find without falling into this a trope of victimhood, perhaps, which is very dominant and rightfully
I
so,
think,
because the children
yeah,
are victims.
if I could just say, I think one of the great contributions that you make here, which is unique to France, is the idea of the group home. Because
Yes,
as you show, or as you explain, in England and in the United States, the whole thing was to find foster homes for these
right.
kids, which means that they were scattered. But in
Yes,
France, they were grouped into homes
yes,
where they created their own little world, their little republic, as some of them were called, and that I think is very important and unique to France. And that kind of changed the way they experience the whole thing, right? I mean, if you're there together with 100 other children who have also left their parents behind, and who may be from the same town that you are from, that is a different experience from being sent off to some country house in Surrey, and no matter how wonderful it is, you're just there on your own. Where's everybody else, so I
right.
think that is a very important aspect of this whole story.
Absolutely. The
you know
children experience things together. And that is a specificity of France. And it is
that's right.
something that comes not, it's really a convergence of multiple influences. So that's something I really tried to do in the book, was to dig deeper than there were children's homes in France, but to understand why and who's coming at this. And we have on one hand these women philanthropists. It's really the upper classes of French Jewish nobility. On one hand, we have the Baroness de Rothschild. We have her first cousin, Yvonne de Gainsbourg. We have Noémie Elphen Rothschild, who's also a cousin of Germaine de Rothschild, who's offered her chateau as a triage center for the children when they arrive in France. And that's where they interview the children on their religious groups. We have the fact that the children they try to respect the children's identities. And so the children who were Orthodox were sent to the Orthodox Children's Home. That eventually opens. It opens several months after some of the children arrive, but eventually the Orthodox children are grouped together there. But what I show is that, in fact, not all of them, as we saw, were Orthodox. So we have these very complex contexts and these choices, as you said, the groups, and then we have the individuals in the groups, and we have some exceptional individuals. Now, there's a word I did not use in the book, which is hero, right? Because I'm writing against this hero-based historiography. And I argue that in a way, when we talk about heroes, we disassemble our critical thinking and we enter into them. But saying that, the people that you highlighted, Ernst Papanek, André Salomon, and to a certain extent, I mean, and not to a certain extent, no, truly, Germaine de Rothschild, who's extremely active on behalf of the children, especially Charlotte Gossels, the mother of Peter and Werner.
Yeah, she was, I mean, she was like this little obscure heroine, but boy, did she ever, she really, I don't even know how she found the person to whom she wrote, I mean, like, just to help her children who were hundreds and thousands of
Yeah,
miles
yeah.
almost away,
And they
I
might
mean,
be
it's,
listening. They might be listening because I mean, they took a very active role in the research, the entire family. And so the fact that I found that paper trail and was able to show that to the family is something that,
oh, that's right. They were the ones. It was Mr. Gossel's daughter who made that wonderful documentary,
yes,
Children of Shaban, right? Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, that was very interesting. So that the
Lisa
second
Gossels.
generation of these children, of these Kindertransport
Yes.
children, sometimes their own children become, involved in the whole
Yes.
story, right?
And it's
Yeah.
part of I think it's part of the processing of this history, which is it's so extremely violent that there's a need to process and to continue processing and for historians to process what the others have processed. I mean, it's extremely intense. As you said, many did not survive, and these gaps. I mean, this is something that I think is a commitment to kind of situating myself as a historian. I think it's thinking about, well, there are limits to what we can know. Obviously, we can live through the same event, and maybe this is, the influence of literature on history. But the same event will be lived in multiple ways by multiple people. And acknowledging that, and then acknowledging that there are archives that have been lost, archives that have been displaced, looted, taken by the Nazis, and then taken from the Nazis by the Soviet
So
Union.
which ones do you particularly regret not
All right.
having?
Well, okay. So there is something that really incredible that happened as I was reading the index in my last round of proofs of the book. Um, I just checked the spelling of an organization online, and I fell upon the minutes of a meeting held by that organization, although I had not at all found any minutes on this organization. In fact, I didn't find any archives on the organization, and I looked high, low, left, right, everywhere, and could not find them. And in the end, a fellow historian had put an archive online through a different project, and he found at the Memorial de la Shoah here a trove of archives that had been mislabeled. And these were archives that had been looted archives, taken from Germany, taken from France to Germany, Germany to the Soviet Union, and then restituted to France, where the inventory remained uncatalogued.
Wow. Oh my God.
So yes, yes. So I mean, I feel like there's a debug, is a Yiddish word, but some sort of thing that prevents you from finishing a book, right? This is the kind of event. Um, there are more archives, and I think that this is one of the things that comes up is that this history, we still have much more to do with this history.
If I could just interrupt for 1 second, you
Yes,
yourself made an appearance in this morning's New York Times about the discovery of a record set as well. Maybe you could just give us one line on what was uncovered in Yad Vashem.
Yes, well, this was Amy Williams is a fellow historian, and she's been researching Kindertransport to the United Kingdom for years and Kindertransport memory. And Amy has just spent time in the archives of Yad Vashem and fell upon, I believe, the ship registers of the children because they went from Germany to the Netherlands and the Netherlands to the United Kingdom. And so she fell upon the ship registers, which gives a full name of each child, which is significant because many families actually did not know. I think in some families they did not even know that their parents were a Kindertransport child. Because the children are put in foster care, there is a history of hiding and becoming. There's conversion. There's masking identities in the post-war period because the past is so painful that one cannot open it back up again. And so I think that the children's home structure perhaps is more conducive to maintaining previous identities when those identities are respected, when they are respected. It's not the case in all the children's homes, but in the Orthodox children's home, it was the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, isn't Amy Williams linked in some way to isn't she the child or doesn't she have some kind of familial link
I'm not sure.
to,
I'm not sure about
I
that.
thought in the newspaper article, which I also read, I thought it said something to that effect, but maybe I misread it. Whether she herself had a link
I know she's
to
very
somebody.
deeply involved with the Kinder today in the
Hmm.
UK.
Hmm. Mm. Yeah.
So we are almost out of time, but there are a couple of hands. So if we could do this very quickly, I'm going to call on, let's see here, Katrin Schultheis. If you could unmute and pose your question.
Yeah, very quick question. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit something about the involvement of women beyond the sponsorship of very wealthy women that you've talked about. I'm interested in the women who did the community-based work. Could you say a little bit about that?
Of course I can. I'm happy to say that. And I'd like to say that I think we do need to the women in the book allow us to kind of rethink our stereotypes on class because we can think that the Rothschild family might have been so removed from need that they didn't consider the needs of the children. But Germaine de Rothschild was actually extremely active in getting the children there, and then once they were there, in taking them to doctor's appointments, visiting them in the hospital, coming to see them. And their negotiation behind the scenes is extremely important. And in a way, the French Kindertransport story, I don't think it really mobilized huge segments of the Jewish community or larger population, in that I think they tried to keep it quiet. And this is something that I didn't write in the book, but the mention of it in the press is very limited. I found several articles, but not a great deal. I didn't see large debates over how the children should be cared for. And I would say a woman who is from a much more modest background is Andrée Salomon. She is the daughter of a butcher and a seamstress. After her father dies, the daughters in the family have to go to Strasbourg. They live in a small village. They have to go to Strasbourg to work, and they end up living in a Jewish women's home, like a foyer for Jewish women. And she becomes a secretary to a lawyer. And so she starts working at a very young age, and then marries. And through this status of entering into a bourgeois life, aspiring bourgeois life, she becomes extremely active in the Zionist movement and in getting older youth, so children over 20, I would say, who are coming through France from 1933 onwards and who are in agricultural training centers and who are en route to mandatory Palestine. And so Andrée Salomon starts working with these kids, kids who are just a little younger than her, to get them immigration certificates. And she starts working on getting them out of France and to mandatory Palestine. And so she sees the need for getting the children out of Germany in 1938. And she's able, with that previous experience, to work on this issue quite efficiently. And I do think, and this is something that I had to theorize on in the book because he was murdered during the Holocaust, but I do think she had a great deal of help from Rabbi Renee Hirschler, who was a rabbi and whose children survived the war and who were able to hide and survive. Some of the archives survived, but not all of the archives survived. And we're missing his testimony, his post-war testimony. We don't have it. He didn't survive. And so it's very important to recognize that André Salomon was not working alone, but most likely she was really doing the thinking and the legwork, and throughout the war years stayed in France and ended up creating a network of hidden children.
Thank you. We could go on for much, much longer, and I have to apologize to the folks with their hands up and who are posed questions. There was just so much more to be said, but I unfortunately have to draw this to a close at 5:30. So I want to express my sincere thanks to Laura, Rebecca, and Susan for this stimulating discussion. Let me remind folks that the book will be out just in a few weeks' time. So keep your eye out for it. And remember, our next session takes place 1 week from today, Monday, March 31st at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, when we reconvene to discuss Cornell Chang's A Fractured Liberation, Korea under U.S. Occupation. And as always, we hope you can join us. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Good night.